We are back. We are live. This is the return of the Carrot Poker podcast, and this is Pete Clark. With me today on the show is fellow Run It Once coach Cory Mikesell. How's it going, Cory? Welcome.
Good. Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. I want to talk about lots of stuff today, but let's first introduce what you are all about in poker. So you're currently specialized towards PLO now for a while, right?
Yeah. So I started out my career, I think it was probably 2012 in the US. So I was only playing on Bovada at like 5 cent, 10 cent. And that was no limit back in that time. And then kind of grinded it all the way up in the heyday of Bovada when you couldn't deposit more than like $1,000. So you actually did have to grind it up, and all the people who were playing high stakes were people who had like climbed up through those stakes on that site, which actually made the games pretty soft because you didn't have like crushers jumping in from overseas, just like depositing with Bitcoin. And then I'd say 2016 or 17, I felt like No Limit it kind of had a shorter shelf life. So I was more interested in jumping over to a game that I thought had longevity and more complexity.
And studying that game, was that like a bit of a shock to the system at first, going from 2 cards to 4? How did you find that transition, and what did you do to get up to speed in PLO?
Yeah. I mean, it's very disorienting, just like reading your hand correctly. And especially like all the weird counterfeiting things that can happen where you're like, oh, I've got Trips top kicker, and now like there are full houses on board when the board pairs, and I've got like my hand goes way down in value, and now I'm losing to all of these pocket pairs. So yeah, there's a bunch of weird stuff that happens that you just have to get used to. I was using the no limit solvers a lot, and I actually spent a lot of time building PLO models in the no limit solvers, like tinkering around with things, making hands match up to like making the hands, no limit hands have similar equity to PLO hands. Like what I would do is if I wanted to study a two-tone board in Pio Solver, I'd make it a monotone board, and then I would have like a lot of different hands in like the no limit hands that represented the PLO hands, and solve those situations. And you could actually get a reasonable approximation of like a PLO solution. I didn't know how good it was at the time, but when Bunker Solver came out, I was able to test some of my theories, and it worked out reasonably well. Gave me some insight, at least to the low SPR pots. But yeah, the rest is just like experience and getting crushed. And usually in PLO, it was getting crushed by getting it all in a situation where you were either slightly ahead or way behind. We know that's like an important concept in No Limit,
Right.
but there's only a few hands in the game where that really applies, whereas in PLO is like there's about 10,000 of those spots within every range. Like
Wow.
I'm either slightly ahead or way behind here. And so you get it in way behind, and you're like, oh, I have 25% equity in PLO. That's not good.
As a no
You
limit
do
player,
that
that sounds
enough times
great.
and you
I'm like imagining getting a semi bluff called in no limit, and I'm like, yes, I have 25% equity.
yeah.
But yeah, in PLO that makes sense. That's crazy. So you were basically like looking up at the sky without a telescope, like building your own little weird telescope out of equities, and then a real one came out and you looked up at the sky and you saw that everything was pretty much where you thought it was, like with when Munker came on the scene?
I would say that I was in the right hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
If we're using the sky
Mm-hmm.
sky analogy, I had figured some things out about like, when is it good to use a large bet sizing? Like,
Mm-hmm.
at what SPR does it become better to start using smaller sizings? And I identify some concepts that like. One important concept was at like a really low SPR, say SPR1, when we're in position, people think you just shove everything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, you don't really want to be shoving when you have less than 50% equity,
Mm-hmm.
because as it turns out, checking back is a great option in PLO because you have 45% equity and you're going to turn a really strong hand
Yep.
very often, so you don't need to blow the pot up. So I figured things like that out.
Mm-hmm.
But when it came to like single raise pots and deep stack play, no, that was we needed the actual telescope
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
figure that out.
And the telescope itself, or one of the telescopes of PLO, which is obviously Vision Trainer on Run At Once. I've played around a fair bit with that while trying to figure out what's going on. And like you were at the beginning, I'm still looking at a PLO showdown, and I'm just sort of like waiting there, like, okay, who are the chips getting pushed towards? Oh, it was him. Okay, right, I'll figure out why that was later, like that kind
Yeah.
of thing. But I've found that working in Vision for PLO, it's really helped my no limit game as well, actually, because just like certain ideas, like the polarity of equities, and like sort of like the certain thing that really blew my mind, I guess, with PLO, while we're on this technical topic, would be like when you have a hand, like you have a draw of some nature that has reasonable equity. Maybe it has like 40% equity against your opponent's range, 45, 50, 55, something like this. The amount of checking and just general pot containment that Vision and PLO solvers are doing with this kind of hand class, I guess it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that it's not just made hands that can be mediocre in PLO, right? There's not. I feel like there's not as big a distinction between a made hand and a draw. I don't know if you'd agree with that. And there's a lot of these draws that are kind of checking back, playing smaller pots in the middle of the range, and that's pretty cool. Have you played around with Vision yourself, trying to like score streaks on there and like become the GTO bot?
So I've played. So Munker Solver is what's powering Vision.
Right.
Vision's kind of a nicer UI
Uh-huh.
for Munker Solver. So I think there are two directions that you can approach studying, and I think that Vision is really good for the bottom up when you're examining individual spots. But I think there's a limitation to visualizing. You can't see your whole range.
Right.
You're seeing kind of like, what does this component do? What does this component do? And then from there, you can probably abstract, okay, this is like top and bottom pair with a gutter. Is that on the threshold of being strong enough to value bet, or is that a hand that needs to check back and preserve equity?
Yeah.
I started out going in the other direction, and that's what my first book was about, and that's actually what my most recent book is about. And so what I've done is I've taken the Munker strategies, and for people who don't know or haven't played around with it, Munker Solver will compute an optimal solution using ranges that you input. But the way it spits it out is a list of like 100,000 hands with a frequency next to it. Like, play this hand 62, like by betting half pot 62.7% of the time. I'm like, that's not helpful to me at all. So what I would do is I would group each category of hands, and I would look at their overall frequencies, and I actually plotted out in Excel to create this graph, the strategy graph that shows the flow of your strategy from like, okay, we have some sets here that are betting very often. Now we see the line dip. Oh, those value bets that are like, they're value hands that are quite strong enough to bet. So that's where the line starts to dip. And now we have some like high equity semi bluffs in the middle. And then we do some more checking. And then we have some like really weak bluffs that we're going to bet fold. So I plotted this out so that I could get a visualization of what my range looked like, and which is more the top down approach. And then I thought about, why are these hands checking? And imagined how the strategy would change against different opponent types. How does it change when the guy is actually calling 80% of hands instead of 40% of hands? Well, now I can probably value bet wider against that range because my hands are stronger relatively.
And did you always play, I know that your newest book that's coming out shortly, might even be out by the time some people are listening to this, is about heads up PLO, right? And just trying to get to the nuts and bolts, the inner fibers of that format. Did you initially immerse yourself in the heads up format of PLO when you switched over from No Limit back in the day, or did you dabble in 6-max waters as well?
I dabbled in 6-max, but I think my heart was always in heads up. I've liked heads up No Limit more than I like 6-max, and I'm also a national chess master in the U.S. So naturally, like the intensity of the one-on-one competition always appealed to me, and just like the complexity of navigating wide ranges and just like, there's psychology in poker in general, but you can really get deeply into your opponent's head when you're playing heads up No Limit or heads up PLO. So I think that's where my heart always was. And in the US, there weren't really a lot of opportunities to play that. There was some, but this was back when there were heads up tables on ACR before they were totally consumed by bots. So I would play some there and really enjoyed it, and at some point just kind of committed to it.
Cool. Yeah, I think heads up PLO has obviously taken a massive it's had a massive spike in interest since the Galfond Challenge started. Like, I remember at the beginning of that, just seeing this format and just seeing the amount of variance in it was absolutely sick. Like, I remember at the point when Phil was down like 950k to Veni Vidi, and he's sitting there and he's showing like his all-in EV graph, which is down like 1.4 million or something, and it's just like, it's so sick that there's so much variance in the game that he can be on like one of the worst stretches possible while being even worse off in EV and all in EV. That's just how crazy the volatility is in this format of our game. How do you deal with variance yourself? Like, how have you been mental game wise throughout your career? Have you ever struggled with it? You know, do you struggle less or more than the average player? And what would you advise sort of like students of heads up PLO? How do they stay sane throughout this crazily volatile format?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've struggled with it more than other people have. There are some, everyone's got their strengths and weaknesses. So I think there are a lot of people who have a rock solid mental game, but then are not good at either teaching themselves or incorporating new knowledge. So it kind of balances the playing field. And then if you're good at both, you're just the best. You're just like sauce. So yeah, I think I've definitely struggled with it. I mean, there are all sorts of things that I've worked on that have made improvements. A meditation practice, just being incredibly disciplined about that. I went to visit one of my best friends who lives in Prague. He introduced me to a shaman, and we did an iboga ritual. For people who don't know, iboga is similar to ayahuasca. except it's an African root. So that is like a very powerfully introspective experience, where you are basically confronted with the very essence of your nature, and then you have to deal with it, and you can't really deceive yourself. So I found that really powerful. Actually, I listened to a book called Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. He writes a lot about Stoicism, which is, it's kind of like the Western version of Buddhism. And I just found this book incredibly powerful. I listened to it so much and just like internalized the concepts. I recognized that most of the mental game struggles I was having were a connection of like ego resisting the way that reality actually is. Like you want it to be some way, reality laughs at you and says, no, this is the way it is. And when you're resisting that, that is where the pain is. And so, yeah, I mean, my direction has just been how to be relentlessly searching for the truth and searching for reality. And it doesn't matter what you think or feel. If you embrace reality, that is like half the battle. So that was one of the really biggest approaches. The other approach I took was to just be like hyper precise about everything. So for Heads Up PLO, I made spreadsheets that I could use while playing, like pre-flop ranges, which is completely allowed. If you look at the rules, like you can have a piece of paper that has hands on it. And I had it for like every stack size from like 5 big blinds up. And I was like, I had entered this data and made these all in Excel myself. And I even like studied the adjustments. Like, oh, how do you adjust if somebody 3-bets too wide or is too passive or limps too much? So the more precise you are, the less you have to even think and the less emotional I tend to be, at least. I'm just like, oh, this is just what I do. He 3-bets too much, I adjust in this way. It just became more robotic.
You actually just answered my next question there, which was going to be, because what you've just described there in my mind are two very, not necessarily contradictory in any way, but two very sort of coming from opposite ends of the mental game discipline. On the one hand, you're talking about inner work to make your own psyche more compatible with external reality instead of trying to bend a piece of iron or whatever, you're trying to bend the thing that's more malleable, which is actually yourself. And I really like that approach. Yep. Yeah, human brains are softer than iron poker worlds, you're gonna have more luck there. But the other thing I was going to ask you is what you thought about the whole school of thought of mental game issues are simply a lack of knowing what you're doing, and they're like the human state of alarm that resides out of being confused and being startled and being lost. Like, do you think that for a player that's struggling with mental game, what percentage of their mental game effort should they spend on actually becoming stronger technically and knowing what they're doing and studying solvers and learning paradigms and frequencies and things, and building that security, compared with what percentage they should go visit shamans and work on all of that stuff? First, a real quick question before you answer that. How did the shaman get you to face up to all of your sort of inner truths and demons exactly?
So it was with this plant medicine called iboga, which is an African root, so the process or the ritual is everybody comes to this little, completely in the middle of nowhere. It was in the south of Poland. Just like you would never find it. It might not even be on a map. And everyone goes into a completely dark room. There's probably another 15, 20 people there. and you take this plant medicine, which they call wood, and and you're in the dark for 3 days, and there's shamans there that are guiding you. But for me, it created a voice in my head that was kind of like, I would say that it's like almost an angel or something that wants to evaluate you objectively, and like it's something that can tell you the absolute truth about yourself that you're unwilling to embrace. I don't think it's anything like metaphysical or magical. It's just like the chemical interaction that's happening in your brain. But it created this voice that said, okay, I'm going to weigh your strengths and weaknesses and tell you objectively who you are and what problems you have. And so you have no idea what time it is for days. You're just lost in this kind of self-evaluation. And then at the end, you kind of are coming back into your body, recognizing like what's happening. Mm-hmm. And from there, it takes a while, but some truths, you've been kind of gifted some truths about yourself that maybe you couldn't parse before, or you weren't willing to see.
Wow. Would that be the same for someone who was not a poker player, who wasn't introspectively and analytically thinking about themselves and their progress all the time? Like, do you think you had that angel of evaluation experience because you were so used to doing that in the daily grind and in your studies? Or do you think that would be anybody's experience who went through that procedure?
Well, there was 15 to 20 other people in the room who were all non-poker players, and they were experiencing similar things, because we talk about it at the end. I mean, because it's a substance, I think it has a similar impact on most brains. But I do think that if you need to come in to an experience like that prepared. They tell you to have a goal in mind, some objective that you're trying to accomplish, something you're trying to work through. So I think it's definitely not something that you do at a party. Definitely not that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's something that you want to be prepared for. You need to be ready to fight with the darkness. And I think poker players are maybe uniquely prepared for that, because we have to sit there and reflect on our own thinking. But I think there are a lot of people who are searching for that, or who have identified problems in themselves that they can't quite break through, whether it's past trauma or just some limiting belief. So anyone who's ready to do that kind of work, I think it's really beneficial for.
Awesome. And to what extent do you think that maybe not necessarily going into the dark room for 3 days on this substance, but some other form of real self-exploration and working on the internal should take precedence over the mental game view of, it will all be okay if I solve this game objectively. If I know what I'm doing, I'll no longer feel these things. Is there any truth in that approach, or do you feel like the internal restructuring is mandatory for the poker player? We will be back with Cory in just a second to continue this fascinating interview. First off though, ranges, come get your ranges. Solver approved output ranges, fresh off the press. Come get them at carrotcorner.com. This one on your screen right now if you're on YouTube is just a sample. Big blind versus cutoff, 2.5 BB open. What are you going to do? Raise to 12, call or fold. This is the solver's output. You can get ranges for all kinds of spots, squeeze ranges, cold 4-bet ranges with a complete package. Here's a button squeeze against under the gun and cutoff. Rake sensitive, designed for your games. Come get them, carrotcorner.com. You will not find this sort of stuff cheaper anywhere else. Now, back to the pod.
It's definitely a balance. I was trying to think of what percentage I would allocate to each, but I don't think I could give you a percentage because I think it depends on each person. But I said that in my first book that like whenever you feel uncertain or confused, or for me, like I would get that sense of being like the anger starts to well up. You start to feel that heat. That I started to use that as a direction or as like an indicator of like, oh, I feel that because I don't know what I'm supposed to do in this spot.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I was uncertain, I would start to feel a little bit like anxious
Mm-hmm.
or pissed off. And I'm like, oh, that's because I don't know. Um, I haven't worked on my defense against double barrel ranges.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's definitely components of both of that. Like you don't really get emotional when you lose aces versus kings, or at least I don't, because like it's very obvious to me what happened. It's very clear. I got all the money in good. What are you going to do? It's when there was uncertainty that I would like my ego would try to take over to protect me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that you have to pull back. Like, oh, the ego is trying to cover something up.
Yeah.
That's an indication of where I need to go. Um, so that, so I would start to write down, I got pissed off when I faced a check raise of my delay c-bet. Well, that's because I don't know what my delay c-bet in defense against check raise ranges look like. I need to go study that.
Yep.
And then I would balance that with things like meditation and things like reading that book, Ego is the Enemy, or whatever kind of inner work that you want to do, which could be like I've done like the sauna and ice bath treatments and things like that. Or just like really pushing yourself when you're exercising and breaking through mental barriers. That's another form of like self-work that I think is really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I mean it's so difficult because the ego, in a sense, it's never going to fully leave you, and you're almost just trying to tame it and like make peace with it in a way where you no longer feel the fears and the dangers, I guess. Because would it be fair to say that 95 to 100% of tilt issues that we talk about in poker are caused by self-vulnerability rather than anything external? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, unless you're playing like terrible bankroll management and you're playing in a game where like I have only 20 buy-ins for this game, and that is my entire life roll. Like I think that's probably like you'll have tilt problems there, but that's probably a sign that you just need to not play with 20 buy-ins for a game.
Yeah.
But yeah, like when you're tilting and you're a winner in the game and you have a bankroll of 100, 200 buy-ins for a game. It's the ego protecting you and trying to not let you see things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can find a way to use that as a compass and just like go in the exact opposite direction, your ego wants to coddle you here. That is where you're weak, and you need to go after it.
Yeah.
It's like that's your true north.
Yeah, it's a bit like the physical exercise thing, pushing through even when you think you can't. You actually can, even when your ego is telling you that this is too scary a thing for you to face up to. You need to like go in the polar opposite direction and embrace it fully. I think that's quite a scary thing for a lot of people, and the longer you go on in life not doing that, presumably, and letting your ego, coddle you and protect you in these ways, I mean, the harder it gets, right? Like you do a bit of coaching yourself. You've worked with some people with mental game issues and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I joke with some of my students from Central and Eastern Europe that they have totally different mental game issues than people from North America.
Yeah.
it's partially a stereotype, and it's just like I'm teasing them, but there's some truth in that. Like, I don't think I would need to recommend a lot of like ego is the enemy to a lot of my like Central and Eastern European friends because they all already think that they're just like awful, even though they're like way better than like
Yep.
one student I have is just crushing the games, great attitude, great approach in heads up, and like we started at maybe 1-2, 2-4, and then he's like smashing 10-20, and then he switched over to 5 card and smashed that, and then he's coming back to 6 max, and he's like, I don't know if I can beat like 50 cent a dollar. I'm like, all right, dude, you're gonna be fine. I believe in you. We need to learn some things, but you're gonna do fine. Whereas um, like the problems that I had and people maybe from America is the opposite. I am the greatest. I am the crusher the greatest crusher of all time. And then like you got to rein that in because it's blinding you from seeing that like you've got a lot to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. For some reason or other, I've noted this demographic as well. That when I teach students from the UK, I'm very often telling them, why did you fold here? You know, like in this spot, you need to be entitled to 25% of the pot. You folded at least 40% equity. You know, what's going on here? And it's very much like these people are, not always, there are exceptions, but they're generally making folding mistakes more than they're making calling or raising mistakes. When I work with Americans, there's definitely been this strong leaning towards fight tilt rather than flight tilt. You can describe all kinds of mental game issues, right, I suppose, as a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. That's how I sort of talk about it in poker therapy, that the brain's interpreting the situation in some way, and it's that interpretation program that's throwing you into a response of fight, flight, or freeze. And I find that American students, for some reason or another, particularly East Coast, I've been coaching for 10 years, so this might sound like it must be a small sample size, but by now it's actually quite a large sample size of people. And the fight tilt mechanism for a guy from New Jersey or a guy from New York, it's like 90%. It's just cultural, right? I've got this student, lovely guy called Nick, who talks about how when he was growing up, he was just indoctrinated into this culture of you make more money than this guy, and then you're better than this guy, and then you have bigger biceps than this guy. And a lot of this stuff was going on in the sort of neighborhood where he grew up. And he says it's just so hard to not go into fight tilt at the tables. So maybe this isn't just nature. This isn't just like how we're born or what we are as human brains, but it's also like where we grow up, right? Like how we grow up, how we're raised. All of these things surely have an effect on what our poker roadblocks will be, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think coming from like you don't think of chess as like a combat sport because it's not physical.
Oh, I do. I used to play chess and tilt horribly at weekend congresses. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, and but there's like a lot of ego associated with it. In my experience of like, I had a teacher who was like he was one of those non-functionally brilliant people, like too brilliant. It was also a piano prodigy and a chess prodigy. So just like, how is this person ever going to function in the real world? And like I learned and I wanted to emulate from him, but he had that kind of torture genius of complex of like I'm so much better than everyone else. Nobody can appreciate like the true art that I can create. And he would self-sabotage and did that over and over again in his career as a chess player. And I kind of learned some of those and emulated some of those bad habits of like looking down on your opponent. So thinking like, thinking that like, oh, when you have a winning position, now you're entitled to win, or just because like you might have built a winning position, but like your opponent is a scrappy fighter, like kind of condescending to that approach to the game,
Yeah.
which is a great approach to have. And if you look at the current world champion in chess, he is an excellent scrappy fighter. Like nobody comes back the way that he does. And so it's like I just learned to completely write off a whole approach, and I just totally missed the value and the truth of that approach of like how to fight back. And so like, yeah, there are all sorts of things, all sorts of limitations and um, programming that we have that colors the way that we see the world.
Yeah. Chess is I used to write this series of articles on my website called Chess, Poker, and Life, in which I tried to sort of compare the three realms and sort of say what each one had in common, what the differences were, etc. And I always found myself coming back to chess and just thinking, this is the most ludicrous thing, this game, because I'm never been master level. I'd love to be, but I play off of about a grade of about 1700, and I used to play tournaments at around that sort of level, sort of 16 to 1800 category. And for some reason, I never understood it. I could go to a chess tournament on a Friday night, and I'd go there with my dad. You know, we'd go for the weekend. He's a chess player as well. I would stay over at some horrible hotel with like stains on the curtains in some place in Scotland where like down the road there were just like crime all over the place, and you were just in some like
gunshots,
you hear gunshots, and you were in like some like shopping center complex motel type place because the chess tournament was at like the town hall down the road, or like this kind of crazy shit. And I'd go there on Friday night, be winning my Friday night game, have a winning position, you know, and somehow queen and rook ending, there's a queen in my face, and I have to resign. I'm gonna get mated in 3 moves or some shit like this. This is how I generally lost chess games, and I don't think I've ever felt worse in my life than going back to the horrible hotel room with the stained curtains, having lost on round 1 and being on 0, and knowing that I'm going to be at the bottom of the match list the next day. These tournaments are all Swisses. For anyone who doesn't know, chess with Swiss is where you basically play the people who are on a similar score as you, right? So if you're on 1 point, you'll play someone that's there or thereabouts in the standings. So Cory, now that I've learned, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but now that I've learned that you're a chess master, what was your mental game like at chess? Did you get more or less emotional with chess than you did with poker throughout your career?
Probably more, because chess was the first thing that I really started to build my identity on, because I started playing when I was 16, and I was very like lost teenager. I knew I was one of the smarter kids, but I didn't have a direction or a passion. So it was the first thing that I really cared about. I also liked writing, but it wasn't, that was maybe a little bit earlier, and chess was the first thing that I really worked hard at, where like over the summer in high school, I would just stay in a dark room for 8 hours studying books, because I just had like this insane drive. So I think I had way too much of my identity wrapped up in it, and my ability, like I was evaluating myself as like that, the fact that I could get good at this really fast and become a master pretty quickly, that said something about me as a person. And for a while I did want to be a professional, but the part of the country I was from, there weren't really that many players better than me, and it was going to be hard. Like it's chess and poker are the opposite, because like in poker you want to play against weaker players so you can make money. Chess, you want to go play against stronger players and get your head beat in, and then get better and like gain from that. So it was hard to find that competition in my area. So yeah, I think then I allowed myself to get very wrapped up in it, and a lot of my self-worth and identity became tied to it. And I had similar problem to what you were describing, where like, yeah, I'd get the winning position, but then my ego would get in the way, and it, instead of seeing it as like a new puzzle, now I saw it as like I'm entitled. I deserve to win. And that's exactly when you have your opponent backed up in the corner in anything, that's the time you have to be most vigilant. Doesn't just have to be chess. It can be any competition.
Yeah, yeah. And in chess, things can change incredibly quickly. Like in many positions, they're fraught with a few moves that might look semi-reasonable that are actually massive blunders and will swing the position majorly in your opponent's favor. So yeah, I mean, I could talk about chess all day. It's a fascinating game, but as this is a poker podcast, I will come back to poker briefly. So what you were saying there about your self-worth being wrapped up in chess and that sort of raising the stakes and almost cornering you, right? Because if your self-worth resides in one thing, if that thing goes wrong, you've nowhere to go. You're then the animal backed into a corner, and that's when all of your survival mechanisms are going to start firing. And I had a very similar conversation with a student a few weeks ago, a guy that was, may even listen to this and recognize who I'm talking about. He was very, very good at jiu-jitsu, taught jiu-jitsu, ran successful gyms across the country, and took up poker again, sort of like as many people did when COVID hit, post Black Friday, after a hiatus, and basically said, right, the gyms are closed, there's not much going on right now there. I have to make money. I have to have to make a success of myself this next year. I'm going to make it at poker. There's no plan B. There's nothing else. I have to do this. And his tilt issues were pretty bad at certain points. He was making folds that afterwards he recognized were quite large blunders. But the investment just felt so wrong, so untenable to make an investment in a spot where it was completely the best thing to do. And we basically, through talking mental game coaching a little bit, boiled it down to the fact that his ego felt like it had nowhere to go. It was like do or die. And whenever a human is placed in one of these situations, it brings out these kind of these overly emotional responses that then ruin our clarity of thought and cause blunders. And I think in chess, there's something about just the adversarial part of it, even if it doesn't represent all of your self-worth. I always, like in a general sense, I always felt that in a game of chess that lasted 4 hours, that became my world. It was me and my opponent and a clock, and the silent ticking and obnoxious coughing and weird sounds that chess players like to make during their games, and this would resonate through the hall. And I just remember like coming out of a game of chess feeling like this is everything. Like that last 4 hours became my life. It became my world. It became my be all and end all. And I think in poker that's a very dangerous thing. So I guess my next question to you is, how did you avoid that trap when you then transitioned from chess to poker? I guess the chess lesson about yourself that you learned through chess probably helped, but how did you kind of avoid the solipsism of just like you in the computer, you and your bankroll, you and your self-worth in that screen? Like, how did you get around that in the earlier parts of your online PLO heads-up career?
The short answer is I didn't. The short answer, or the long answer is that the things that I was telling you that I'm kind of recognizing retrospectively about the chess playing, I didn't really understand when I was 22 and started switching from playing chess to playing poker. Mm-hmm. I mean, the best way to do it, if you have that massive problem and you're not ready to deal with it, massive ego problem, is the other thing that we talked about, which is just like work so hard that you can cover up that issue, mm-hmm. which I did for a while because I have just like, when I get passionate about something, I have this crazy drive where I can just go 15 hours a day, nonstop, let's do it. Mm-hmm. Not a problem. And that leads to other things, other issues like hurting relationships and pushing people away that you wish you hadn't pushed away, and damaging relationships and damaging your health and things like that. So I think that was the approach I took, was I'm just going to work incredibly hard. And I did. And that is effective when you have good learning methodology and you have just like this iron will to succeed. But eventually it hits a wall.
Mm-hmm.
Like for me, kind of like the high stakes, like the very highest stakes is where I started hitting that wall because like I was making up, I was compensating for tilt issues by just being so technically beyond my opponents at like 2.5 and 5.10 that they just like I was going to have to tilt incredibly hard for them to be able to beat me, especially in the long run. But then when you have like an elite pro who's also pretty sound technically, maybe not quite as good, but then has a sounder mental game, now, lose 2 or 3 stacks and it's a different world,
Yeah.
right? So for a while on the upswing and climbing, I was just able to compensate for those issues by just like beating my head harder and harder against the like solver and against theory and just learning all of that stuff. But then at some point you realize like, okay, maybe I'm still 20% technically superior to the people I'm playing, but I'm shooting myself in the foot with these mental blow-ups. Like now, if we talked about like the distribution of which one to fix, for me it was like it had already shifted to now like, okay, I maybe only need to do 10 or 20% technical work and the rest needs to be on the mental game work.
Yeah, because you'd sort of hidden behind that technical barricade for so long and used it to protect yourself from your own mental game issues. What I think a lot of people listening to this, will get a lot of relief and sort of just general maybe reassurance from the fact that an elite player who has been at the top of the game, who coaches at high level, who's a poker author, has gone through such a tough time. And it's probably very relatable to a lot of people out there and their struggles. What formats did your tilt take? Like when you were playing in these high stakes games, you'd moved up, you were battling the guys that had the slightly put in less work than you, weren't quite on your technical level, but they had their mental game together. In what ways was your game crumbling? Like, given that you knew the game so well, how did those mental game issues manifest in ways that actually constituted EV loss?
So the way that I think of it is it's like your poker knowledge is maybe a pyramid or a tower. It's a bunch of things stacked on top of each other. And so like when you're on your A game, I can access all this information that's at the top level.
Yeah.
And then when, I've lost a few buy-ins, things are starting to go wrong. When I'm thinking at that top level, I'm taking into account like 10 different data points in each hand.
Yeah.
But now like I'm a bit tilted, I'm a bit tired, whatever. Now I'm only taking in 8 of those 10 data points. And you keep subtracting as your access, your ability to reach that top level of knowledge is kind of being denied by your tilt. So I would start folding hands like we talked about that I wouldn't fold. They would be like a reasonable exploitative fold. Like, oh, maybe this player's not bluffing enough. You could justify it, but I wasn't accounting for all of the data that I normally could account for. Like, oh, he's also opening. His RFI is like 10% wider than it should be.
Yeah.
And I just like totally forgot that when I folded on the river. I'm like, oh, this is a spot where, it's hard for him to have bluffs. I'm just going to fold.
Yeah.
But then I'm like, oh, but he's already showed up with bluffs in this spot before. He is opening a little bit too wide. He's c-betting a little bit too wide. And so I've just forgotten about all those data points that I know, but because I can't reach that top level of my knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
I'm making a suboptimal decision that might be right given 8 of the 10 data points, but you add 2 new data points, and now it's totally the wrong decision.
Yeah, it just swings it wildly. It's like I always try and explain bluff catching to my students in that he gets to the spot with this barrel full of balls, and the red balls are the bluffs and the green balls are the value bets, and there's an initial distribution of those balls within that barrel, and that may well be far more impactful on whether the spot is under bluffed or over bluffed than his actual cognition about whether he feels like bluffing when holding a red ball. And trying to get that across, that it's not just about whether people like bluffing the spot or whether it's a spot they frequently pull the trigger on, but just the initial range that they land there with, that they're not gods. They don't control that down to a T. They don't choose every hand consciously that makes that range up. And so if you let someone reach a spot who's not a very experienced player, you check back the flop in no limit with king 4 and king 3-3, the turn is a 6 and you check back again, that can be a hugely exploitative and profitable play against a beginner, because they're just going to barrel 4 times more often with queen high than they should on the river. They're going to bet queen jack. They're going to bet these hands that have to check down. So I think like a technical point that comes up there is just like, if you could have accessed the very top levels of your poker tower there, you would have actually just been accessing a very simple thing that you can normally do very well, but your brain was overloaded. It was losing capacity due to the mental game struggles. And then it's not, as I was saying on a podcast recently, really strong players, they're not thinking extremely complicated things in real time. They're not coming up with intricate, elaborate thought process. Rather, they're accessing lots of simple ones that are the most relevant to the decision at the right time. And so it makes perfect sense that you can lose 2 out of 10 thought processes that aren't even the most, complicated ones or difficult ones. It's just too many for the capacity at that point during the mental game struggle. It's a fascinating idea. Well put. Yeah, do you want to come in on that before I move on to the...
Oh, no, yeah, I totally agree with everything you were saying. And then there's also a new, kind of relatively new mental game problem, which is coming in the form of like misevaluating your opponents. Because I also played too much against a guy that, it looked like he had a couple leaks, but he turned out to be a bot.
Right.
And it was just like the ranges were constructed against like a slightly different bet size.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I had identified a leak and honed in on it, like, oh, he's slightly overfolding
Mm-hmm.
to my half pot sizing. Well, that's just because it was actually a bot that was designed to face maybe 60% or 2/3.
Yeah.
But like they're so good everywhere else that you're not going to be able to beat it. And so like I think there's just so many ways to deceive yourself in poker, and I think that's a new one that we have to deal with. You have to objectively evaluate, like, this is kind of sketchy. I don't know what's happening here. I need to maybe take a step back and evaluate.
Yep.
And this guy seems like a little bit too good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also very tempting, isn't it, when you've played 200 or 500 or lower and you're working your way up to these elite stakes, you're always going to have this mentality of like, oh, people don't understand this, people don't get this. And if you have that mentality for too many years and the games start to improve, the quality of play in your games improves and people get better and better and info is everywhere, you're going to end up having conceptions that you ingrained years ago that are no longer that valid, and you're going to be applying them to pools that are much more advanced now. And I've certainly had problems with students who have these sweeping generalizations that they learned a long time ago when maybe those were valid, and now they're getting crushed in so many spots by not adapting. So I think that's another thing that's happening in the solver age, is we use solvers and we're so tempted to think that we're the only one that sat and put the hours in, and we forget that our opponents are sitting there doing the same thing, like no longer playing quite how they used to as well. So I think there's a lot of new mental game pitfalls in this age of solvers and bots that perhaps didn't exist before. That's a good point.
Yeah.
I want to move on and talk about, you described yourself as a guy that will put absolutely everything into his current project. So I want to talk a little bit about your books and your career as an author before we wrap up here. First off, I know you're writing a novel just now, you mentioned to me. Did you move a bit away from grinding poker seriously, a bit more in the sort of educational writing, fictional writing, these things instead of that? Did you get jaded with playing poker? Did you get sick of it? Did you feel like it wasn't worth it to put in the work, or were these other ventures just more sort of tempting for you? What caused that shift?
Yeah, so I went to New Zealand actually before the lockdown, and I started playing on the international sites that I didn't have access to in the U.S. and played and like did quite well during lockdown, playing heads up on party poker, and I grinded super hard. And after a few months of that, it just wasn't feeling rewarding, and part of it was that mental game work that I had done was actually telling me that I wasn't getting a lot of spiritual value out of poker. You know, there's the financial benefit from it was there was diminishing returns where like now I had enough money that I wasn't going to have to worry about money for a while. And so I wanted to start pursuing things that were, you know, enriching to me, enriching to other people, and allowed me to build connections. So one of the things I got interested in was language learning. And I've been teaching myself German for the last year or slightly over. And it stretches my brain in a different way, but it's also rewarding and has allowed me to connect with people that in new ways that I couldn't connect before. And I think writing was had a similar aspect where I could connect with people when I was writing about poker and help them. It was less competitive. Something that Peter Thiel has said in interviews is look for ways to be less competitive in life. Like that's actually, there's a limit to how far you can get just competing and trying to beat people in a zero-sum environment. And instead look for ways to not be competitive. And so writing was an exploration of that, and it was also a new skill. I think for a while I had this idea that I was a great writer because I had done well in school and had people tell me that I was good at writing. And then when I did some of the ego work, I realized, oh, I'm actually like not that great of a writer. I'm seeing all of these weaknesses and holes in my skill. And then I realized, well, that's great. That means I have a lot of room for improvement. I have a lot of opportunity to learn. And so I saw it kind of as a challenge and just as more, when I thought I wanted to think back on this time, maybe when I'm 50 or 60. And I thought, like, if I looked back and saw that I was just grinding poker, it wouldn't, I would feel like I had missed something. So I started to get interested in writing. I wrote the PLO book for high stakes players back in 2017. And that was my process of learning the game and looking at the solvers in a different way, like trying to visualize PLO ranges in a creative way. That book was PLO 3-bet pots, game theory and practice. And that's actually what led to me being invited to be a Run It Once pro. Is I actually just sent Phil Galfond a copy, and he was nice enough to review it. That review is still on Run It Once. And so he then he asked me, okay, maybe make some videos for us. And then I always wanted to write a beginner book or a book for beginner to intermediate players. It applies like if you just know the rules, like if that's the only thing you know, you could use this book. But also if you were like a 50 NL, 100 NL player, this book is going to be applicable for you. It's called Poker Foundations, and it's on Run It Once. And I wanted to give people an understanding of the top level of poker theory, even if they were not striving to be like the highest stakes player, even if they were just playing for fun. I noticed going back to the chess topic, like I can't play like the very best grandmasters in the world, but I can look at their games and I can appreciate the beauty in what they're doing, just like someone who is maybe a classically trained pianist but is not like a world-class pianist. They can watch someone who is world-class and be like, oh, I know what he's doing. I know how hard that is, what that technique that she just used. That was the idea behind this book, is to give people the deepest poker truths that I could, without giving them like the trick plays and the things that are really common in older poker books.
Yep.
Yeah, like I was really striving to give it like a first principles approach. What is the deepest truth? How do we build on that all the way up to like game theory levels of complexity?
Yeah. I'm actually thinking about doing something similar this year. I wrote the Grinders Manual, which was like pre-GTO sort of stuff in 2015. It was maybe when solvers were first coming on the scene, but no one was really that acquainted with how to use them properly. And no one had derived like full GTO principles from them yet. But now that I've kind of like locked myself in a room with coaching and with solvers and with a very analytical, like kind of the way I teach is sort of, I want to take a 25 NL player and I want to eliminate all of the trick play bullshit, the archaic nonsense from his game, the stuff that captures tiny fragments of the EV of a situation, and force him to learn with his own willingness, of course, GTO principles, and base his game on that, even if he doesn't use them at the highest level, that even the simple things he's doing are based on GTO principles. And I think that's possible, and I really respect what you've done in Poker Foundations, because why shouldn't there be books like this in poker? There's lots of chess books that are like The Games of Bobby Fischer, one of the most brilliant chess players of his time, and a beginner can read through and appreciate the brilliance of that. Why can't we formulate, our learning based on the true essence of poker, based on objectively what poker is, instead of I just feel strongly, and I could go on about this all day, so I'll be careful not to, but I feel very strongly that the game has been dumbed down for people who don't want to take it rigorously and don't want to learn it thoroughly for a very long time, and we're left with a lot of the pollution and fallout from the damage that's been done by all this awful teaching. And I'm a big advocate of cleansing students of all of this damage before I teach them GTO, and trying to sort of take it in that approach. So I guess my question for you, my second last question of the day for you, Cory, would be, how do you deal with that when you take on students, and you're a very theoretical guy, the way you're teaching, the way you're learning is extremely truth-seeking and empirical. How do you deal with people that have very firmly ingrained thought processes from the days of pretending, from the days of making up nonsense to justify a lack of knowledge?
Yeah, it's really about going to first principles. So I kind of in that book, I kind of do it almost to a comical level, where the first example isn't even a poker example. It's actually a bet that a friend made against me, she's a non-professional gambler, but very brilliant. And so I use this example about gambling on whether a friend is going to pass a driving test, because it shows how a professional gambler thinks. And so what I was doing is I like turn the bet that she offers me into an EV calculation. So I'm figuring out in my head as she's offering this bet to me how often I need to succeed. Like she's laying me 1-to-1. So my friend needs to I was teaching my friend how to drive. So I need my bet needs to win half the time because I'm getting laid 1-to-1. And I've seen my friend pass the maneuverability part when we've tested it like 95% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm actually doing the EV calculation as my friend is making this bet with me. And so it's showing just like the true essence of not even gambling, but like investing in evaluating uncertain outcomes, which like we all do that, getting like buying a house. People used to think that's an obvious investment. It's maybe not so obvious anymore. Getting a college degree, it's also kind of a gamble. Mm-hmm. Starting a business, yep. Certainly any kind of investing, poker playing, even relationships. So it's coming to like a first principles to that almost an insane degree and then building on that. So like when I'm working with students and we're talking about poker first principles, they will often bring up a lot of assumptions, and the skill is basically pointing out like that's an assumption. What you're saying may or may not be true, and it's based on things that you've seen other people do, which may or may not be correct, and we don't know whether are they exploiting something? Are they being exploited themselves? It's really about probing assumptions. Like, so a great example of an assumption in PLO is like you got to bet for protection.
And the no limit. This is the most overdone thing ever.
So it's overdone in PLO. People think like, I have a hand that's vulnerable, therefore I need to bet for protection and whatever they think they're trying to achieve. But often those are the hands that you need protection. You need to protect yourself from building a big pot with a hand that like, oh, if I bet this hand that is 55% equity, when I get called, I'm going to be behind. Mm-hmm. I need to protect myself from that situation. I need to protect my stack.
Yep.
So it's looking at like assumptions like that and turning them on their heads and reminding people, you're betting for value or you're betting as a bluff. Protection is a side effect. Yep. And if your hand is not good enough to bet for value, it's not worthy of protection. So like, yeah, looking at things like that, at assumption-driven models that they have in their heads, and challenging them, and hopefully the student's open to that challenge. Most are. Like when most people pay you a lot of money to coach them, they're ready to hear it. But I've turned people away after a couple sessions because they wanted me to confirm their beliefs, yep. Those assumptions that they had. And I'm just not going to do that. I mean, even if you're paying me a lot of money, I don't care. I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, that's always the toughest part of coaching, is when you realize that the motive is actually to practice their trade of their own little thought process that's maybe something they've always done and always sort of relied upon, and they're more defensive about that than they are about not making it as a poker player, for example, or not making money or not moving up stakes. So it's a tough one, and yeah, sometimes you do have to turn people away. Before we wrap up, this has been a fascinating conversation, but before we bring it to an end, do you want to talk a little bit briefly about your newest venture, that book, and what it's going to be targeted at?
Yeah, so in about a couple weeks, I'm going to be releasing a book on heads up PLO. This is going to be for high stakes players, so the price point is going to be similar to my first book. We're at somewhere, yeah, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be for high stakes players who want to, reach the top levels in heads up PLO. So I've built this database of Munker solver solutions that I put into this visual form, and I've got like thousands of them covering every spot in the whole game tree at every stack size. And what this book is like the assimilation of all of that knowledge and putting it in a format for people to digest. So like GTO concepts that are turned into heuristics that people can use and apply in game. And the book is going to be called Heads Up PLO, the Definitive Guide. And I really am I set out to cover every stack size, like totally change the way people think about playing the game, because nobody ever considers playing short stack when you play heads up, but it actually, there are huge edges to be gained just because nobody knows what they're doing. Yep. So I'm showing people all of these different approaches that you can take to even beat the best players in the world, because they're not familiar with the things that I'm talking about. So yeah, it's a book that should revolutionize how people look at the game.
Awesome. And where will people be able to get their hands on that if they are looking to?
So I'm going to make a post on Run It Once when I release the book, and on there, in that post, which will be in the high stakes PLO forum on Run It Once, I will put a link to a website that I'm creating where I'm going to sell the book. I'm actually only going to sell it in physical copies, just because anything you put on the internet ends up on the black market. Yeah. So I'm going to make it a bit harder, and I have some other creative ways of making sure that it's not pirated. Yeah. So there'll be a big post I make about it in the PLO forums, the high stakes forums on Run It Once, and you can buy it on the website I've created. I haven't created the website yet, so I can't give you an address, but it's coming soon.
It's exciting. It sounds like drugs or something. Like we're going to get this rare thing that's only available in a small pocket. It's the thing though, with the price point being higher, you're just so much more susceptible to that kind of thing, because my products are a bit lower. There's a bit of acceptance that it will happen, but with a higher price point, makes perfect sense. Anyways, Cory, this has been a really fun conversation. I'd love to have you back on in the future after the book's out and talk to you again. And I'd love to pick your brain about how I get my lousy chess grade up as well. But for now, we'll wrap up there. And thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun, Peter.
All right, guys, this has been Pete Clark with the Carrot Poker Podcast. We'll be back in a week's time. For more from me, you know where to go. It's carrotcorner.com, and we are currently selling our solved ranges, as I said earlier on. In the middle of the show, we've got 50 to 100 NL, solver approved, full pre-flop strategies on there. Much, much cheaper than most other places in the market. If you're looking to get a foothold in pre-flop, check out carrotcorner.com/solved ranges, and we will see you next